The phone on my desk vibrated, the name on the screen a ghost from a past life, Mark Sterling. I let it ring. Outside my office window, the floor of Apex Machining hummed, a symphony of robotic arms and precision lasers I had designed myself. It was the very system Mark and his brother had laughed at 5 years ago. "Stick to the factory floor, Callahan," they'd sneered. "You'll always be an employee, not an owner." The ringing stopped. A moment later, a text flashed on the screen. "Trey, we need to talk. It's urgent." I looked out over my Cleveland empire, the polished concrete floor reflecting the glow of molten steel. Urgent for them, maybe. For me, this was justice. Mark and David Sterling. They were cut from the same bolt of cheap, arrogant cloth. Mark was the face. All polished shoes and a handshake that felt like a threat. David, the numbers guy, would kill a multi-million-dollar deal over a rounding error, but couldn't see the future if it hit him in the face. They'd inherited their father's company and wore it like an oversized suit. I remember standing in their oak-paneled office, my blueprints spread across their ridiculously large desk. I had poured my life savings into the initial R&D for the automated system I was proposing. I wasn't asking for a handout, just a partnership. A way to modernize Sterling fabricators and secure all our futures. David didn't even look up from his spreadsheet. "The capital outlay is absurd, Ray." Mark just smirked, leaning back in his throne-like leather chair. "Ideas are cheap," he'd said, the words dripping with condescension. "We pay you to weld, not to think. Know your place." My place was now this 100,000 square foot facility, producing parts at nearly half their cost. Their legacy was hemorrhaging cash trying to keep up. I looked at Mark's text again. I typed back a one-word reply. My cost. Where? His phone buzzed again. The Mill Steakhouse. 8 p.m. Of course. The Mill. A stuffy, overpriced restaurant where they celebrated victories they hadn't earned. The irony was so thick I could taste it. That place held the memory that had lit the fuse for all of this. It was 6 years ago. The GE turbine contract. A $500,000 job their own engineers had botched. The timeline was impossible. The specs were a nightmare. And penalties were piling up daily. I was a foreman then, not just a welder. I was the guy they called when the blueprints didn't match reality. I practically lived in the shop for 2 days straight, fueled by stale coffee and the metallic tang of ozone from the welders. I recalibrated the jigs, rewrote 3 of the 5 machining processes, and personally welded the final critical seam myself at 4 a.m. on a Sunday. I saved them. Not just the contract, but their reputation. The following week they threw a celebratory dinner at the mill. They invited me, of course. A gesture. I sat at a small table in the back with 2 other foremen, nursing a warm beer, while Mark and David held court at the main table with the GE executives. I watched Mark raise a glass of champagne, his voice booming across the room. To the Sterling vision he'd toasted, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. He never once looked my way. That was the night I understood. It didn't matter how much I bled for them. I would always be the hired help, a tool to be put back in the box when they were done. I went home that night and didn't go to bed. I went to the garage, pulled out a notepad, and started sketching the first gear of what would become the Apex automation system. The blueprints I'd shown them a year later weren't just an idea. They were my escape plan. They represented a second mortgage on the house my father, a lifer at the old Republic Steel plant, had left me. It was everything I had. And they dismissed it with a wave of their hand. Know your place. My place was here, in the control room of a factory that was a decade ahead of theirs. A factory built with the money they refused to invest and the brains they refused to acknowledge. I looked at the text again. Plana Paul the Mill. They were trying to put me back at that small table in the corner. Trying to re-establish the old order. A small, cold smile touched my lips. I'd be there, but this time, I'd be the one choosing the table. The 20-minute drive to the mill felt like 5 years in reverse. The day after they'd laughed me out of their office, I'd handed in my resignation. My letter was 2 sentences long. Their response was a 10-page legal threat delivered by a courier. A non-compete clause. Boilerplate stuff I'd signed without a thought a decade earlier. Their lawyer's letter, however, was anything but boilerplate. It was a declaration of war, specifically designed to keep me from working in metal fabrication anywhere in Ohio. It was meant to break me. They didn't stop there. When I started trying to source components for my first prototypes, doors slammed shut all over Cleveland. Suppliers I'd shared beers with for 20 years suddenly had their prices double, just for me. Machine tool reps who used to call me every other week stopped returning my calls. I could feel the Sterling's shadow looming over every conversation. Mark was poisoning the well, making sure I died of thirst. I wasn't entirely alone. I had one guy with me from the start, Frank Kowalski. Best damn machinist in the tri-state area, and he'd seen the writing on Sterling's wall long before I did. He quit the day after I did. We were working out of my garage trying to build the first automated welding arm. 3 weeks in, Mark called Frank personally. Offered him my old foreman position, a 30% raise, and a corner office. Frank told me later what he'd said to him. "I'd rather weld in Ray's garage for free than polish trophies for you two." Mark hung up on him. But loyalty doesn't pay the mortgage. The money from the house was vaporizing. I remember sitting on an overturned bucket in my garage at 3 a.m. The smell of ozone and desperation thick in the air. I was surrounded by half-assembled prototypes and a mountain of denial letters from every major bank in the city. David Sterling's influence ran deep in the financial sector. They had me in a chokehold. My wife Anna would bring me coffee, her face etched with a brave smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She never once asked me to quit. That was the only thing that kept me going. The break came from Akron, of all places, a small community credit union. The loan officer was a woman named Sarah Jenkins. Turns out her father and mine had worked the same shift at the Republic Steel plant for 30 years. She didn't just look at my debt-to-income ratio. She looked at my blueprints, at the calluses on my hands, and she understood. While the big bank saw a liability David Sterling had warned them about, she saw a steelworker's son fighting for a future he was building himself. She saw the legacy. She approved the loan. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was the crack in the wall they had built around me. It was the first deep breath I'd taken in a year. So as I handed my keys to the valet at the mill, the memory of that struggle was a cold, hard weight in my gut. This wasn't a dinner meeting. It was the final move in a game they had started. They had tried to bury me, to erase me from the industry we'd all grown up in. They didn't realize they'd only planted a seed. Now they were about to see what had grown. I walked past the bar, the scent of old money and grilled steak unchanged. The maître d', a man with a professionally bored expression, started toward me, but I gave him a slight shake of the head and kept moving. I knew where they'd be. They were at a large circular table near the windows overlooking the river. The power table. Mark stood as I approached, his hand outstretched, a practiced smile plastered on his face. It was the same smile he'd given the GE executives all those years ago. It didn't reach his eyes. His eyes were haunted. I ignored his hand and sat down. The smile faltered for a fraction of a second before he recovered. "Ray, good to see you. You look well." David, already seated, just nodded, his gaze fixed on the condensation beading on his water glass. He looked like he'd aged a decade in the last year. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the pale, clammy sheen of desperation. "You said it was urgent," I said, my voice even and calm. I wasn't here for small talk. A waiter appeared, a lifeline for Mark. "A bottle of the 98 Cheval Blanc for the table," he announced, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. I looked at the waiter, then back at Mark. "Just a whiskey for me, Macallan 18. I paused, letting the silence stretch. "And they'll be paying." The waiter glanced nervously between us, but Mark gave a tight nod. The small surrender seemed to cost him more than the price of the bottle. He sat, the expensive suit suddenly looking a size too big for his frame. We sat in a suffocating quiet until my drink arrived. I took a slow sip, the smoky peat a familiar comfort. I didn't rush them. I let them sit in the mess they had made. Finally, David, the numbers guy, couldn't take it anymore. He pushed a thin leather folio across the polished wood of the table. "Our third quarter projections," he said, his voice raspy. "They're catastrophic. The automotive contracts, the aerospace components, we've lost them all." "To Apex," Mark finished, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He leaned forward, the phony charm replaced by a raw, pleading edge. "Ray, we built that company. Our father." I held up a hand, cutting him off. The mention of his father, a decent man who would be ashamed of his sons, was a line I wouldn't let him cross. "You inherited a company," I said, my voice low and cold as a Cleveland winter. "I built one." I let that hang in the air, a verdict they couldn't appeal. I looked from one panicked face to the other. "Now, what do you want?" David slid the folio to the center of the table. "We're proposing a merger," he said, his voice straining for a corporate confidence he no longer possessed. "A strategic alliance. Sterling Apex. We combine our legacy client base and infrastructure with your technology." He couldn't bring himself to say, "Vision." Mark jumped in, laying the charm on thick. "Think about it, Ray. A Cleveland powerhouse. We have the name, the history. You have the engine. Together, we'd be untouchable. We'd be honoring what our father built, taking it into the future." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We'll make you a full partner, equal shares, all three of us." I almost laughed. Equal shares in a sinking ship. They weren't offering me a seat at the table. They were begging me to stop the ship from going under. I let the silence hang, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. I watched them, two cornered animals, trying to convince the hunter to join their pack. They thought this was a negotiation. They still didn't understand. I took a final sip of the Macallan and set the glass down with a quiet, definitive click. "No," I said. The word, spoken so softly, hit them like a physical blow. Mark's plastic smile evaporated. David flinched as if I'd thrown the glass at him. "No?" Mark stammered. "Ray, be reasonable. This is the best deal for everyone. It's the only way to save hundreds of jobs." "You should have thought about those jobs when you were laughing at my blueprints." I cut in, my voice still quiet but now edged with steel. "You should have thought about them when you called my suppliers and tried to blackball me. You had your chance to partner with me 5 years ago. That offer is expired." I leaned forward, placing my hands on the table. The power had shifted so completely it felt like the room was tilting in my direction. "But I do have a proposal for you," I continued. "It's not a merger, it's a liquidation." David's face went white. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not buying your company. I have no interest in the Sterling name, and I certainly have no interest in your debt. I am, however, interested in your assets. The building, the land it sits on, the heavy machinery. I'll make you a cash offer for the tangible assets, based on their current depreciated value, nothing more." David, the numbers guy, found his voice first. It was thin and reedy. "The book value, our brand equity, that's insane. It's worth 10 times that." "Your brand is worthless," I stated, looking him dead in the eye. "Your biggest clients are now my clients. Your reputation is for being too slow and too expensive. The only equity you have left is in the brick and steel. My offer is what a bankruptcy court would give you in 6 months, except you get it now, and you get to avoid the public humiliation of the auction." I paused. "Well, most of it." Mark stared at me, his mind finally catching up to the reality of the situation. This wasn't a rescue, this was an execution. "You son of a bitch," he breathed. "You planned this, all of it." "You called me an employee," I said, my voice flat, emotionless. "Employees follow orders, owners make plans." I pushed my chair back, the legs scraping against the floor. I knew this was the moment, the final turn of the screw. "The offer is $50 million, cash. Take it or leave it." $50 million was an insult. It was just enough for them to pay off their creditors and walk away with their tailored suits and nothing else. It was the price of their arrogance. "And there's one more condition," I said, standing over them. They looked up, their faces a mixture of fury and despair. When the sale is final, your name comes off the building. Immediately. The sign, the letterhead, every last trace. Sterling Fabricators will cease to exist. It will become Apex Machining Plant 2. I let the words sink in. I wasn't just buying their factory, I was erasing their legacy. I was taking the company their father built, the name they'd inherited and squandered, and wiping it from the face of the earth. My lawyer will have the offer on your desk at 9 a.m. tomorrow, I said, pulling a few bills from my wallet and dropping them on the table to cover my drink. An act of final dominance. You have until 5 p.m. to sign. If you don't, the offer is rescinded, and I'll see you at the auction. I turned and walked away without looking back. I didn't need to. I could feel their stunned silence boring into my back. They had tried to tell me my place. And now, I had taken theirs. I drove home from the mill with the windows down, the cold November air failing to cool the fire in my gut. The city lights of Cleveland bled together, a smear of gold and white against the dark. I wasn't celebrating. This didn't feel like a victory lap. It felt like a verdict being carried out. A force of nature, like a flood or a fire, that had been building for 5 years and had finally been unleashed. I had offered them a partnership once, a chance to build the future together. They had chosen to try and break me instead. The thing about trying to break a man forged in steel is that you just make him harder. The house was quiet when I got back. A single lamp was on in the living room, and Anna was curled up on the couch, pretending to read a book. She looked up as I closed the door, her expression searching my face. She knew where I'd been. She'd lived every second of this war with me. I didn't have to say anything. I just nodded. A long, slow breath escaped her lips, one she'd been holding for half a decade. She put the book down. What did they want? A merger, I said, shrugging off my jacket. They wanted to be partners. The absurdity of it hung in the air. She gave a small, humorless laugh. After everything? They're drowning, I said. They just wanted me to be their life raft. I sat down opposite her. I made them a different offer. To buy the assets, the plant, the land. I met her eyes. And to take their name off the building, forever. She studied my face, seeing the cost of the fight. And they have until tomorrow to decide? 5 p.m., I confirmed. She reached across the coffee table and took my hand. Her touch was the only thing that felt real. Whatever happens, Ray, we're already free. The next day was the longest of my life. I was at Apex by sunrise, walking the floor, the familiar hum of my machines a steadying presence. Frank Kowalski found me calibrating a new plasma cutter, a job I could have given to any one of 20 technicians. He handed me a coffee. Heard you had dinner with royalty last night, he said, his tone dry. They're not kings anymore, Frank, I replied, not looking up from the machine. Just men in a castle with crumbling walls. Hope you sent them my regards, he grunted, before turning back to his own work. He knew better than anyone what was at stake. I spent the day buried in logistics, in shipping manifests and supply chain negotiations for a new contract, a massive order for drivetrain components from Ford. The very contract Sterling Fabricators had held for 30 years. I didn't look at the clock. I didn't check my phone. I would not give them the satisfaction of my anxiety. If they didn't sign, I'd proceed to the next step. Simple as that. I had a business to run. At 4:55 p.m., I was in my office overlooking the factory floor. The symphony of automation played out below me, a testament to an idea they had called foolish. My phone remained silent. I felt a flicker of something, not doubt but curiosity. Was their pride really so strong they'd rather burn to the ground than hand me the ashes? At 4:59 p.m. my phone rang. It was my lawyer, Ben. Ray, he said, his voice all business. Ben, I replied, my own voice steady. We have it, signed, scanned, and delivered to my inbox 1 minute ago. A wave of something cold and heavy rolled through me. It was done. Any last-minute changes? I asked. Ben chuckled. They tried. Oh, they tried. They attempted to add a clause. They wanted a small, bronze plaque to remain in the lobby, in memory of Robert Sterling, founder, a tribute to their father. I closed my eyes. Their last, pathetic attempt to cling to a ghost. And what did you tell them? I told them your offer was for their assets, not their sentiment. The plaque is an asset. It goes. There was a pause. They signed it anyway. Ben finished. I hung up the phone and stood there for a long time, looking out at the glittering, efficient, and relentless world I had built. I thought of my own father, his hands scarred from the mills, his pride in a hard day's work. I hadn't just avenged myself, I'd honored him. The Sterlings had tried to dictate my place in the world, to keep me on the factory floor. They were right, in a way. The factory floor was my place. The difference was, now I owned it. Both of them. 2 weeks later, I walked the floor of what was now Apex Machining Plant 2. The air itself felt defeated, thick with the smell of old oil and stagnation. It was a museum of inefficiency, a monument to men who'd stopped innovating the day they inherited the keys. Many of the old Sterling crew were still here. I'd made it clear that anyone who wanted to work and adapt had a place with Apex. Their faces were a mixture of suspicion and a desperate kind of hope. As I passed the main assembly line, a voice I knew well cut through the din. "Look at you, strutting around like you own the place." It was Henderson, a foreman who'd been the Sterlings' loyal dog for 30 years. He stood with his arms crossed, a sneer plastered on his face. I stopped and faced him, my hands in my pockets. "I do own the place, Henderson. That's what the paperwork says." "You destroyed a legacy," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Robert Sterling built this company with his bare hands. And his sons let it rot with theirs," I replied, my voice calm and level. It sliced through his anger. "A legacy isn't just a name on a sign. It's the promise you make to your people, that their hard work builds something that lasts. The Sterlings broke that promise. I'm here to keep it." I left him fuming and continued toward the main offices. The Sterlings' oak-paneled shrine was empty now, stripped of its trophies and oversized chairs. On the dusty, vacant desk, lying face down, was the small bronze plaque my lawyer had mentioned. I picked it up, its weight surprising me. Asterisk in memory of Robert Sterling, founder. He'd been a real steel man. Like my father, he deserved better sons. Frank Kowalski appeared in the doorway. "What do you want to do with that junk?" he asked, nodding at the plaque. I held it for a moment longer, the cold metal heavy in my hand. Smashing it would have felt good for a second. But this wasn't about them anymore. This was about me. "Box it up," I said, handing it to him without another look. "Have it couriered to Mark Sterling's home address." I paused. No note. Frank broke into a slow grin. He understood. It was a final, quiet message. "You can have your history. I'm busy building the future." I turned away from the empty office and looked back at the factory floor, at the men and women watching me. My victory wasn't in tearing down their name. It was in building up my own. Have you ever had a boss or someone in authority totally underestimate you? Drop a comment and tell me how you proved them wrong.